Some say forgiveness is divine. They say time heals all wounds. They're wrong, dead wrong. Because for Elias Thorne, forgiveness was a luxury he couldn't afford. And time? Time only sharpened the blade of his vengeance. He was a pastor, a man of the cloth, a beacon of light in his Michigan community. Or so everyone thought. Then the whispers started. Ugly, venomous whispers that coiled around his reputation like a serpent, suffocating the life he knew. His own daughter, barely a teenager, accused him of the unthinkable. A violation so grotesque, so deeply scarring, that it shattered not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. His wife, the woman he'd pledged his life to, stood by, a silent accomplice in this destruction. The congregation, his flock, turned their backs, their faith in him ashen. The courts, swayed by the venomous lies, delivered their judgment. 25 years. 25 years he rotted in a cage, the echoes of the accusations ringing in his ears, each day a hammer blow to his soul. 25 years to fester, to boil, to transform a man of God into something else. They thought they'd buried him. They thought they'd broken him. They were wrong about that too, because Elias Thorne didn't just survive those agonizing decades. He plotted, he planned, he waited, and when he walked out of those prison gates, he wasn't the same man who went in. He was a man reborn in the fires of betrayal, a man with a singular, terrifying purpose. He was back, and the reckoning he had in mind, well, let's just say it was biblical. 1995. Michigan. Elias Thorne, a young man of 24, stood at the altar, his heart swelling with hope and promise. Beside him, Sarah, just 19, radiant in her white dress, her eyes sparkling with what he believed was love. They were young, full of dreams, ready to build a life together. Elias, recently ordained, was the new pastor of a small but growing church. Sarah, beautiful and charismatic, was his perfect complement. 2 years later, their daughter, Emily, was born, completing the picture of domestic bliss. Or so it seemed. Fast forward to a sweltering summer evening, a day that would forever be etched in Elias's memory as the day his life shattered. He was in Emily's room, helping her with her homework, a typical father-daughter moment. Emily was 14, a bright, inquisitive young woman on the cusp of adulthood. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream ripped through the quiet of the house. It was Emily. She burst from the room, her face contorted with fear and anger, pointing a trembling finger at her father. He touched me, she shrieked, the accusation a dagger plunged into Elias's heart. Sarah, who had been in the kitchen, rushed in, her face a mask of shock and something else. Something Elias couldn't quite place at the time. Confusion, anger, or something colder, something more calculating? But Sarah didn't remain silent. She didn't stand by. She joined in the accusation, her voice trembling but firm. He's been different lately, she said, her words adding fuel to the fire. I've noticed things. The police arrived, their presence shattering the peace of the neighborhood. Elias, bewildered and terrified, tried to explain, to deny the accusations, but his words were lost in the chaos. Emily's screams, Sarah's accusations, it was a perfect storm of condemnation, and Elias was caught in the center. He was arrested that very night, the cold steel of the handcuffs a stark premonition of the nightmare to come. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the small town like a plague. People who had once greeted him with smiles now looked at him with suspicion, with disgust. The church elders, once his staunchest supporters, called for his resignation. The media descended like vultures, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust in his face, each question a fresh wound. The trial was a circus. The prosecution painted Elias as a predator, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Emily, coached and manipulated, recounted her fabricated story, her tears and trembling voice convincing the jury. And Sarah? She sat in the courtroom, her face impassive, offering no support, no denial, only a chilling silence that spoke volumes. Elias's defense was weak, his protestations of innocence falling on deaf ears. The evidence was circumstantial, based entirely on Emily's testimony. But in the climate of fear and suspicion, it was enough. The verdict came quickly, guilty. The gavel fell, the sound echoing the finality of Elias's downfall. 25 years. The sentence was a life sentence, not just in terms of time, but in terms of the damage it inflicted. As he was led away in handcuffs, Elias looked back at his wife, searching for some flicker of recognition, some sign of remorse. But he found nothing, only a cold, empty stare. Prison was a brutal awakening. The reality of his situation hit him hard. He was no longer Pastor Elias Thorne, the respected man of God. He was inmate number 47291, a convicted rapist, a pariah. The other inmates treated him with contempt, their hatred fueled by the nature of his crime. He endured beatings, verbal abuse, the constant threat of violence. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional torment. The betrayal by his wife, the false accusation by his daughter, these wounds cut deeper than any blade. He spent his days in a fog of despair, his nights haunted by nightmares. But slowly, imperceptibly, something began to change within him. The despair began to morph into anger, the anger into a burning desire for revenge. He would not forgive. He would not forget. He would make them pay. Released from prison, Elias spent a week in a halfway house, a sterile, impersonal environment that mirrored the hollowness inside him. The walls, painted a drab, institutional green, seemed to close in on him, a constant reminder of the cage he'd just left. He wasn't ready. Not yet. He needed time not to heal but to prepare, to gather his thoughts, to solidify his resolve, to sharpen the edges of his long-simmering rage. He wasn't going back to prison. He was going back to war. Then he went to see Emily. He found her in a quiet, unassuming suburban neighborhood, a world away from the chaos she'd unleashed a quarter of a century ago. Two-story houses with manicured lawns, children playing in the streets, the picture of middle-class respectability. A life built on a lie. He watched her from a distance for a while, a ghost from her past observing the life she'd constructed on the ruins of his. He saw her laughing with neighbors, picking up her children from school, the image of a happy, well-adjusted woman. The sight twisted something inside him. How could she be so normal? How could she live with what she'd done? He approached her cautiously, timing it so she was alone in her front yard, tending to her flower beds. The recognition in her eyes was instant, a flicker of fear quickly masked by a forced smile. "Dad," she said, the word sounding awkward, almost foreign on her lips. She warned him to leave, her voice trembling but firm. If he didn't, she'd call the police. The threat hung in the air, a pathetic attempt to wield the power she no longer possessed. He left, retreating down the street, but he wasn't deterred. He knew she wouldn't call the police. The last thing she wanted was to dredge up the past, to expose the secrets she'd so carefully buried. He returned a few days later, his approach more calculated this time. He waited until she was outside with her husband, a chance encounter disguised as polite conversation. He introduced himself as an old friend of her father's, someone who'd lost touch over the years. He was charming, affable, the mask of the gentle pastor almost perfectly in place. He talked about old times, carefully steering the conversation towards her childhood, towards her father. It was then, with her husband present, that Emily finally broke. She gave him the attention he wanted, and they had to speak in private. The carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the guilt and fear that had been gnawing at her for years. The words tumbled out in a rush of confession, a torrent of regret and self-justification. It was her mother, she said, her voice choked with emotion. All her mother's doing. A plan hatched with the assistant pastor, a twisted scheme to take everything from Elias. She was just a child. She insisted, manipulated and coerced by her mother. She begged him to understand, to forgive, to move on. She pleaded with him to never contact her again, to let her live her life. Throughout her confession, Elias remained impassive, his face a blank canvas. He listened, his eyes betraying nothing, the burning fire of his resentment hidden deep within. Unbeknownst to her, he recorded every word, the confession a crucial piece in his plan. He needed proof not for the courts but for himself. He needed to hear it from her own lips, the confirmation of the betrayal, the justification for what he was about to do. He left without a word, the recording clutched tightly in his hand, a small, cold comfort in the face of the overwhelming pain. He had what he needed, confirmation, fuel for the fire that burned within him, a fire that was about to engulf everything in its path. Sarah. Finding her wasn't difficult. She hadn't exactly been hiding. She was living in the same town, in a bigger house, driving a newer car, wearing the kind of expensive clothes Elias had never been able to afford, even when he was the pastor. She'd remarried. To him, the assistant pastor, the man who'd been lurking in the shadows, waiting for his chance, ready to step into Elias's shoes the moment he was gone. Now he was the senior pastor. The irony wasn't lost on Elias. They'd taken everything from him, his reputation, his freedom, his family, and now they were living his life, enjoying the fruits of his labor, basking in the glow of his former respectability. Elias found them. He watched them. He saw the pictures, smiling, happy, a picture-perfect couple. Vacations in exotic locations, lavish parties, their faces beaming with contentment. They'd built a life on his ashes, on the lies they'd told, on the pain they'd inflicted. They were living comfortably, enjoying the fruits of Sarah's betrayal, lavishing the money that should have been his, the money he'd worked so hard to earn. The sight of them together, so carefree, so oblivious to the storm brewing on the horizon, was like pouring gasoline on a fire. It solidified his resolve, confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Or at least what he perceived as justice. A twisted, warped sense of justice, perhaps, but justice nonetheless. Now the planning began. Elias was methodical, meticulous. He was no longer the impulsive young man who'd trusted blindly, the man who'd been so easily deceived. He was a strategist, a chess player carefully moving his pieces into place. He was patient. He could afford to be. He'd waited 25 years. What was a little longer? The fire within him burned hotter with each passing day, fueled by the memories of his betrayal, by the sight of their happiness, by the knowledge that they had gotten away with it for far too long. They'd lived their lives without a second thought for the man they'd destroyed. They'd moved on while he'd languished in prison, his life a living hell. He was going to make them pay. He was going to make them understand the true meaning of betrayal. He was going to give them a taste of the hell he'd lived through for 25 years. And he was going to do it in a way they would never forget. He was going to make them regret the day they decided to frame Elias Thorne. The invitation came in the form of a letter, handwritten in a familiar script that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. It was from Elias. He was out. He wanted to meet, not just her, but Emily and her husband too. He said he had something to reveal, something they needed to hear. He was vague, cryptic, but the underlying threat was clear. If they failed to appear, they would regret it. Fear gnawed at Sarah. She hadn't thought about Elias in years, had pushed the memory of his downfall to the darkest recesses of her mind. Now, he was back, a ghost from her past, threatening to disrupt the comfortable life she'd built. She showed the letter to Emily and her husband, their faces mirroring her own apprehension. They debated what to do. Ignore him? Go to the police? But what could they say? That a man they'd framed for a crime he didn't commit was threatening them? In the end, fear outweighed reason. They decided to go. The meeting place was the old church, the one Elias had presided over, the one where their lives had first intersected. It was a Sunday evening, the church empty, the silence amplifying the tension that hung in the air. Elias was already there, standing at the pulpit, a strange calm radiating from him. He looked different. Older, of course, but there was something else. A hardness in his eyes, a set to his jaw that hadn't been there before. Then Elias dropped the bombshell. He revealed Emily's confession. playing the recording for all to hear. The silence of the empty church was broken only by the sound of Emily's own voice, confessing her part in the deception. But the recording wasn't all he had. He had other evidence, 2 financial records, and other pieces of the puzzle that painted a clear picture of their conspiracy. This wasn't just about Emily's word anymore. This was irrefutable. Sarah felt a wave of nausea wash over her. This was it. The moment she'd dreaded for 25 years. The truth was out. Elias turned his gaze on them, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. He spoke of their betrayal, of their greed, of the years he'd lost. He spoke of the hell they'd put him through, the pain they'd inflicted. He spoke of justice. His voice rose, echoing through the empty church. His words a condemnation that resonated with the very stones. Elias spoke again, his voice cracking with emotion, tears welling in his eyes. "There is nothing left to live for," he said, his gaze fixed on them, a mixture of sorrow and rage in his eyes. "The dreams a butterfly had were snatched away, crushed beneath the weight of your lies. I am a man that came from nothing, built everything with my own 2 hands, and you stole it all. You stole my life, my family, my purpose. You left me with nothing but ashes and the burning desire for this. I won't rest, I won't find peace, if I don't do this. I've wrestled with this for 25 years, begged God for guidance, for a way out of this darkness. But there is none. This is the only way. Let God judge us all when we appear before him." Suddenly, a strange smell filled the air. Smoke. They looked around in confusion. Then Sarah screamed. Flames. Leaping from the back of the church, engulfing the walls, the pews, the altar. Panic seized them. They scrambled for the exits, but the doors were locked. They rattled the handles, screamed for help, but it was no use. Elias stood calmly amidst the chaos, watching as the flames spread, his face illuminated by the inferno. He'd planned this. He'd set the trap. He'd locked the doors, disabled the fire alarms. There would be no escape. Not for them. Not for him. The fire raged, consuming everything in its path. Screams filled the air, mingling with the crackle of flames and the crash of falling timbers. The church, once a sanctuary, was now a tomb. The fate of the 4, Elias, Sarah, Emily, and her husband, was sealed. They were trapped, engulfed in the inferno, their screams swallowed by the flames. The fire burned for hours, reducing the church to a smoldering ruin. When the emergency services finally arrived, it was too late. Nothing remained but ashes and charred debris. The fate of the 4 remained ambiguous. Their bodies never recovered. But the message was clear. Betrayal had a price, and sometimes that price was paid in fire. The news spread like wildfire. The story of the burning church and the 4 people trapped inside dominating headlines across the state. The media frenzy was relentless, reporters swarming the scene, cameras capturing every angle of the smoldering ruins. Speculation ran rampant. Was it an accident? An act of arson? A targeted attack? No one knew for sure. But then, a new twist emerged. A voice recording, leaked to the media, sent shockwaves through the community. It was Emily's confession, her voice trembling as she admitted to the lie, to the conspiracy that had destroyed Elias Thorne. The recording had been sent to an old friend of Elias's, someone he'd confided in during his prison years, someone he'd entrusted with the truth. Now that truth was out, exposed for all to see. The revelation shifted the narrative. Suddenly, Elias wasn't just a victim. He was a martyr, a man driven to desperate measures by the injustice he'd suffered. The public sympathy shifted. The questions became more complex. Was Elias justified in his revenge? Was he a hero or a villain? Was he a victim seeking justice, or a perpetrator consumed by vengeance? The lines blurred, the answers elusive. And what about Sarah and Emily? Were they purely motivated by greed, as Elias had claimed? Or was there more to the story? Were they victims of their own circumstances, caught in a web of deceit they couldn't escape? The questions lingered, prompting viewers to delve deeper, to examine their own beliefs about justice, revenge, and the complexities of human motivation. What should Elias have done? Should he have gone to the police with Emily's confession? Could he have found another way to clear his name, to seek justice through legal channels? Would that have been enough to heal the wounds, to erase the years of pain and suffering? Or was his act of revenge, however extreme, the only way to find closure, to reclaim his life? And what would you have done? Put yourself in Elias's shoes. Imagine the years of wrongful imprisonment, the betrayal, the loss. Could you have forgiven? Could you have moved on? Or would you have been consumed by the same burning desire for revenge? The story of Elias Thorne is a tragedy, a cautionary tale of betrayal, injustice, and the destructive power of vengeance. But it's also a story that prompts us to examine our own beliefs, to question our own capacity for forgiveness and revenge. Who do you feel bad for the most? Elias, the man who lost everything? Or Emily, the daughter caught in the crossfire, forced to live with the consequences of her actions, forever haunted by the ghost of her father? There are no easy answers, no simple solutions. Just the lingering questions, the echoes of a fire that consumed not just a church, but the lives of those trapped within its flames. So, let's recap. Elias Thorne, a pastor framed by his wife and daughter, spent 25 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Released, he sought revenge, confronting his daughter and learning the truth of the conspiracy. He then invited his ex-wife, her husband, and his daughter to the church, where he revealed their betrayal and, in a final act of vengeance, set the church ablaze, seemingly perishing with them. The leaked recording of Emily's confession ignited a media firestorm, raising complex questions about justice, revenge, and the human cost of betrayal. But the story doesn't end there. It lingers, it resonates, it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. What is justice? Is it found in a courtroom, or is it something more primal, something that resides in the heart of the wronged? Is revenge ever justified? Can the scales of justice ever truly be balanced after such profound betrayal? And what are the consequences not just for the perpetrators, but for the victims themselves, for those who are left to pick up the pieces of shattered lives? Was Elias a monster, or a man driven to the edge by unimaginable pain? Were Sarah and Emily cold-hearted conspirators, or were they themselves victims of circumstance, trapped in a web of lies and deceit? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions that demand we look inward, that challenge our own moral compass. We want to hear from you. What do you think? Was Elias justified in his actions? What would you have done in his situation? Do you feel sympathy for any of the characters? Share your thoughts, your opinions, your reactions in the comments below. Let's discuss this complex, disturbing, and ultimately human story. And if you found this video thought-provoking, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and share it with your friends. It helps us reach a wider audience and spark even more important conversations. Don't forget to check out the links on the end screen for more videos like this, exploring the dark corners of the human psyche and the enduring power of betrayal. This story is a reminder that the line between victim and perpetrator, between justice and revenge, is often razor thin, and that the consequences of our actions can ripple through time, leaving scars that never truly heal.